This week on Young Rock, 87 Dwayne's relationship with Karen is on the rocks. The Johnson family's financial problems come to a head, and Atta inspires Rocky and Dwayne to stop working the gimmick and start working the solution. We're talking Young Rock Season 1, Episode 8 on Pro Wrestling Repackaged. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Chris.
And my name is Tessa.
And this is Pro Wrestling Repackaged, where the squared circle meets the small screen. This week, we're discussing Season 1, Episode 8 of Young Rock, My Baby Only Drinks the Good Stuff. But before we dive in, very quickly, I just wanted to give a little shout out and thank you to Drew from the Last Row podcast for the very nice review that he left us last week. If you're not familiar with the Last Row podcast, it is a very good movie podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts of all time, in fact, and I really appreciate Drew leaving us this very nice review. And if you want to check out the Last Row podcast, you can go to thelastrowpodcast.com or search for them on any platform. They're on all of them. It's a real good time. I definitely recommend listening to The Last Row. Start with one of your favorite movies. They've probably reviewed one of them, and then just go from there. It's a complete blast. Drew and Badway are awesome hosts, and thank you again to Drew for that awesome review that he left us.
And just a reminder, for the month of April, if you leave a review for any podcast on podchaser.com, 25 cents will be donated to Meals on Wheels, which is then doubled if that podcast replies to you. So if you leave us a review, we'll reply to double the donation.
Yes, that's podchaser.com. You don't even have to leave us a review. Leave any podcast a review. But if you do leave us a review, we would really appreciate it. We'd love to hear feedback. You know, we're 8 episodes into this now. We're rapidly approaching the end of our first season, with the end of the first season of Young Rock coming very soon. So we would love to hear your feedback about the podcast, what you've been enjoying, what you don't like, anything you'd like us to cover in the future, things you'd like us to take a look at. So if you want, you can reach out to us. We have an email address. It's pwrepackaged@gmail.com. You can tweet us at pwrepackaged, or you can follow us on Instagram. And we don't mention these off the top very often, but I really wanted to make mention of it because part of why we started this podcast is we kind of wanted to cultivate a little bit of a community here of people who enjoy wrestling and wrestling-related shows and would like to talk about them. So reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, it is now time for this week's edition of The Rock Says.
The Rock says, The Rock says.
What's The Rock saying?
Tessa, what was your favorite quote from this episode?
So my quote comes from 2032, when The Rock has to diffuse his cheesesteak controversy by apologizing to the people of Philadelphia. And he says, "I never meant to disrespect anyone by eating a bowl of meat and whiz."
This is the state of political campaigns in 2032.
I didn't realize people were so touchy about their sandwiches.
Yeah, this strikes me as kind of Young Rock's commentary on maybe cancel culture. Maybe the idea that in over a decade, it will get to the point where if you eat a meal the wrong way, people will quote unquote cancel you, which I would hate for it to be a commentary on that, because I think it's a bit absurd and silly to equate cancel culture, aka consequences for your actions, to you ate this food the wrong way, therefore we are not going to vote for you anymore. But in this weird, surreal reality that Young Rock has created, it seems like all the little things mean the most and the big things aren't even a factor, which is why a guy like Dwayne Johnson can be on the ballot.
My gut feeling is that this is just pure silliness, and that if we're going to have a critique of cancel culture, there's so many other things you could cancel The Rock for.
Very true. Very true. But again, it seems like in this reality, it's hyper-focused on the wacky. The actual issues don't even seem to factor in this reality, which is a very interesting take. And either it's a satire of the rapid decline of the political landscape in 2021 and how that deteriorates further to 2032, or it's just pure comedy. Who knows?
With Young Rock, you never know.
Who knows with 2032? It could be a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, but meat and whiz. A bowl of meat and whiz.
That just sounds gross.
Yeah.
I've never had a Philly cheesesteak, so I don't know.
I've had a few in my day. I probably did something wrong somewhere along the way. So good thing I never intend to run for president. My quote this week is an Atta quote. So this is another special edition of Atta Says. And my quote is, I need you two to stop working the gimmick and start working on a solution. A real solution, because we've got real problems, like rent being due in a few days. We could get evicted. This should be your priority, not what some girl thinks. And I love this quote because Atta needs to be the one to light a fire under the two men in her life. She needs to be the one to get results and get them on a course of action that is going to be productive and improve everyone's situation, not just their individual situations. And I love that. I feel like she is the driving force behind The Rock and his motivation to accomplish all that he has in his life. And I think that this was a really pivotal quote and a pivotal scene in this episode and in the season as a whole. And to be honest with you, I would vote for Atta based off of a speech like this.
We need to make her VP.
Seriously, you could put The Rock in office all you want, but if Atta's the one pulling the strings, writing the speeches, I think then we would inspire some people to get some things done, and I think The Rock himself would also be getting some things done.
She probably has a more interesting and diverse life experience than The Rock.
Which is why I'm glad this show exists, because it shines a light on Atta Johnson, not only as a character, but as a real person as well, and might make people a little bit more interested to do some research on her. And I think that's one of the main takeaways of this show is not only putting wrestling in the mainstream on an NBC sitcom, but also putting The Rock's family, and in particular, the members of his family that never had that big spotlight, at least not on this international scale that we see now with young Rock. So another edition of Atta Says, and I wouldn't be surprised if we got another one before the season is over. But that brings us to our discussion of this episode, Young Rock Season 1, Episode 8, My Baby Only Drinks the Good Stuff. Directed by Dana Reed and Jeffrey Walker, and written by Erica Oyama. Tessa, what happened this episode?
So in this episode, 15-year-old Dwayne has to beg for fine-ass Karen's forgiveness after he stood her up in the previous episode. And she's willing to do that, but she has one condition. He has to take her to his house for dinner with his parents. Now, Dwayne, a liar and a thief, is worried about Karen realizing that he isn't rich, so he asks Rocky for advice, who then encourages him to work the gimmick even harder, which leads to a disastrous date with Karen that eventually forces him to come clean. Meanwhile, Atta and Rocky face financial problems when their most important client goes on a 2-month-long vacation. Oh, and we also learned that The Rock eats cheesesteak incorrectly. Yes. Important stuff.
Yes, the most important issue, the most pressing issue heading into the 2032 election. So important, in fact, that his polling numbers go down as a result.
He really made the northeast portion of the country unhappy.
This is an unforgivable sin, or is it? Overall thoughts of this episode before we really dive into all that ridiculousness. The first thing I want to really mention is that this episode subverted a trope that I thought it was kind of going to go down a little bit in Dwayne pretending that Diane's house was his while she's away for 2 months. And we both thought that this was going to happen because at the end of the episode, you mentioned that to me. And I was like, that's exactly what I thought was going to happen this episode. As soon as she said she's going away for 2 months, I thought that he was going to trick his parents somehow into showing up there for the dinner, and then he's going to bring Karen there, and then they're going to have, I don't know, maybe hire someone to be his butler, something like that. I really thought that was the episode we were getting, and it wasn't.
Yeah, I didn't know how exactly it was going to go down, but I figured for sure it was set up that way, that that's what was going to happen. So when he's just driving by the mayor's house, I was like, what is this?
Yeah,
what's he doing?
It could have easily devolved into that kind of super overdone type of trope. And I'm glad that it didn't. But at the same time, I feel like it would have made this episode stand out a little bit more. Because as it is, I didn't think that this was the strongest episode of the season overall. It felt a little bit light on comedy and a little bit light on story. But ultimately, it did bring both Dwayne and Rocky to a very important turning point by the end. So I think that overall, it is a very consequential episode. But the path to get there, I thought, wasn't the strongest of the season.
Now, what I'm noticing a lot with these 1987 episodes, the first one was great. I really loved the first one. But I feel like these episodes feel more tropey than the rest. Like, even though they didn't go with that trope, they still feel like it's just following a stereotypical script.
Right.
Any sort of sitcom. And without, like, the wrestling stuff from the 1982 episodes, the football aspect of the 1990 episodes, it just feels like, I said this with the last 1987 one, it just feels like this could be any show.
I can totally see where these episodes start to feel like this is just any other sitcom, but with The Rock and his family.
Right.
Whereas 82 and 90, I feel like, are kind of their own thing, doing their own thing. And they also they're a lot more unique in that 82 is very heavily wrestling focused, and 90 and 91 are very heavily college football focused. And those are both kind of unique settings and unique themes for a comedy show of this kind.
Yeah, and like having these tropes in the 1987 episodes isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, those tropes are tropes for a reason. They work. But I just find it interesting that the other two eras seem to have a lot more originality than the 1987 ones.
I also think that there are a lot of other things propping up 82 and 90. For example, we get a lot more of the group of wrestlers together in 82 and Rocky's interplay with the wrestlers and a lot more wrestling scenes and all the things with Leah. And I think that that really makes those episodes very strong. And with 90 and 91, I think it's the fact that, yeah, we're looking at an almost fully grown version, like this primordial version of the guy who becomes The Rock. So that makes it immediately a little bit more captivating. I don't know, those episodes just have a different feel to them. And I feel like it is hard, maybe a little bit hard to be sandwiched in between those two, where 87 has some wrestling elements, but not as much as 82. And it's just now approaching the football of it all at the end of this episode, where before it was completely devoid of that. So it's just kind of teen Dwayne going to school, trying to get the girl, which in itself is a very classic story, but it is one that we've seen a lot. So I think that's the difference between all of the three different time periods at this juncture, where we are at kind of the very tail end of season one. I'm sure we will have more thoughts, plenty more thoughts on the differences and similarities between all three time periods at the end of the season, which we, again, are rapidly approaching, which is kind of wild. But let's jump into 2032. Let's talk cheesesteak gate. Do people still do that? Do they still put gate at the end of everything?
Probably.
Let's talk cheesesteak dragon gate. So the Rock's in some trouble. And the one thing I wanted to make mention of is how dramatic the opening of this episode was. You kind of had some low pulsing music that created some tension. Sandy looks very distraught and anxious. The Rock pulls up alongside him on the street and they're talking about polling numbers, and it finally felt like, oh my God, is something actually going to happen in 2032?
Like, what did he do?
What did he do?
At first, I thought it was maybe something to do with the general again, that maybe she messed up because she seems to be having all the PR problems.
Oh, sure, yeah. General Monica Jackson not even mentioned in this episode, which is interesting after all of the kind of backlash that she got that we saw in the last episode. But no, this is the people of Philadelphia versus Dwayne Johnson over the matter of a protein-style cheesesteak.
Yeah, you have an angry, booing crowd gathered outside of Philly's Prize, which is a food truck. They are just so deeply upset that The Rock appeared to have eaten a cheesesteak without bread.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's his cardinal sin here.
I guess that's what protein style means. And this is something that will just completely destroy his presidential bid.
How dare he?
How could you eat a sandwich incorrectly?
So offensive is this to the people of Philadelphia that his polling numbers are down in the Northeast.
Tanking.
Which is interesting because in real life, his polling numbers are actually doing quite well.
Yeah. There's a Newsweek poll that asked about celebrities running for a variety of public positions. And according to the results, Johnson for president would be supported by almost half of the country. 46% of Americans in this poll said that they would support The Rock running for president.
They must not be watching Young Rock.
And The Rock is going with it. He says if it ever happens, it'd be his honor to serve the people. I don't think we need to give him this power.
He's been talking an awful lot. I feel like every day I see a couple of news articles about The Rock wants to unite this country. Getting a little,
I don't know.
Getting a little nervous here.
I mean, he tweeted the article. He talked about it. The people in the replies seem to not agree.
Yeah, I believe I saw Stephen Colbert trying to dissuade him from going down this road. So it'll be interesting to see if life imitates art coming out of season 1 of Young Rock.
The show is telling the future.
We'll keep tabs on that. Anyway, let's move on here, as The Rock does, as he tries to deflect this angry mob from killing him in front of a food truck by talking about stories of his 15-year-old self in Bethlehem, PA. So let's move on to 1987 now. I believe the transition this week was, a person isn't defined by the mistakes that they've made, but how they respond to them. Which, actually makes a little bit of sense for this episode.
It does, but it just feels silly.
In context of what is going on in 2032, it is very silly that he would stand there and tell this story, but at least it makes sense. It tracks. I'll say that. It tracks.
But then the angry mob has to sit and listen to his story of trying to patch things up with care.
But again, it's The Rock, and he has put entire rooms full of journalists through these stories. Yeah. So what's to say that an angry mob in front of a food truck wouldn't somehow be sucked into his charisma and his charm? Because that is he basically has weaponized that at this point. The Rock has. But we go to Bethlehem, PA, 1987. Teen Dwayne trying to patch things up with fine-ass Karen.
So after standing Karen up, Dwayne is trying all kinds of things to apologize. He runs all the way to her house to beg for forgiveness, but when that doesn't work, he tries again at school. He gives her a stuffed unicorn wearing sunglasses, which is her favorite. So she's ready to forgive him, but she does have one condition. He has to take her to his house to have dinner with his parents, which of course creates all kinds of stress for Dwayne, who has been lying and stealing in an attempt to work the gimmick this whole time.
This aspect of things, this portion of the episode, I was not quite interested in, and I don't think that I've been very interested in the whole Dwayne and Karen saga, just because ultimately it feels a lot less important than some of the other things going on. And that just may be me leaning towards being more interested in the things that either involve wrestling or involve Dwayne playing football for some reason, because I didn't think that that would necessarily be what I gravitate towards in this show, but it really has become that. I feel that this stuff just feels a little bit light. It feels a little bit light on comedy. It feels a little bit light on just story and just interest. It feels like this is kind of the overdone, cliched sitcom scenario that we find ourselves in so many times watching so many of these different shows. And I felt that this was probably some of the weakest, just pure plot of the entire season.
Yeah, it's not particularly compelling, which I think 1990 and 1982 is. And maybe just 15-year-old Dwayne isn't as interesting as like Rocky and Atta. I think they're more interesting in this episode.
Oh, for sure. I think the Rocky and Atta scenes and story, I think I just wanted to sink my teeth more into that. I felt that there was a much more compelling story to be told here with the kind of idea of Rocky Johnson having to make this decision that he makes later, which I hope that we'll talk a little bit more about in depth. But just in terms of this section of kind of phase one of Dwayne's plan to kind of get back in Karen's good graces, I thought that there were some fun moments here. Like we find out that fine-ass Karen has this twin sister named Lisa, who goes to, I think it was a Catholic boarding school.
Yes, with the nuns.
You know, I thought that got a chuckle out of me. It got a laugh out of me. There were just some moments here, like we get introduced to Gabe's El Nostimo pizza delivery car that I felt that was kind of a source of just a recurring gag and a source of comedy throughout the episode. But again, it's just not, this could be any show. These things weren't very specific to this show and why this show works so well in terms of comedy a lot of the time. And that's not to say that the performers weren't doing a great job. I think that Bradley Constant always does a very good job. And, you know, I really like Gabe as well as his strong sidekick. And obviously Atta and Rocky are always just a delight whenever they're on the screen. But I don't know. I was very underwhelmed with this entire story for this episode.
Yeah. So like in this part, when Dwayne's just trying to, you know, get forgiveness, the only part that I really found funny was when he has anxiety butt at school. And then he has to go to the bathroom and he has to use the faculty bathroom and gets into an altercation with a football coach.
What do you call that?
Stress poops.
I don't know how he would be poking out over the toilet stall.
Those, like, the toilets have to be pretty high up.
It's like he was sitting perched on a throne in the kids' bathroom. But yeah, then he goes into the faculty bathroom and gets into that altercation with the coach, which again felt just a little bit like, okay, I don't know.
It felt really exaggerated.
It did. But again, it's
a sitcom.
Kind of a screwball comedy at this point in the 87 episodes. So it does set up important things for later, but ultimately I just found that it wasn't as a lot of the other things that we have seen. That's not to say that there wasn't fun to be had. I think that Rocky's infatuation with that car, the 1987 Lincoln Continental Givenchy designer series that he's so proud of. And I love the moment of him turning up the music and pulling away, turning up the Al Jarreau song and pulling away, which Gabe was very impressed with. And also I loved him getting Gabe to pay for the gas. Not even Gabe, getting Gabe's dad to pay for the gas. What a worker. But so there was a lot of fun to be had here, but ultimately I think this portion of the episode just wasn't as interesting, and we're on the same page with that. So why don't we move on to where Rocky starts to lead Dwayne down the path of when working the gimmick goes wrong again.
Right. So Dwayne's given this ultimatum and he just doesn't know what to do because, as we said, he's been lying this whole time. And once Karen realizes that he isn't rich, she is going to dump him. Gabe recommends having Atta cook a fancy dinner, but Rocky tells him he has to continue to work the gimmick even harder, and he offers Dwayne the Lincoln Continental Givenchy designer series. This leads to a disastrous date. Dwayne won't stop talking about his car. He takes Karen on a dark outdoor picnic, very windy. And finally, his lies are exposed at the mayor's house, which he tries to pass off as his own.
So I had some pretty big problems with this whole portion of the episode. The first is this, I guess, El Nostimo himself, his idea that linguine and clams is some sort of magical aphrodisiac for women just felt a little bit like, okay, he felt very strongly about this. I don't know. Like he went on for a good 2 minutes about this.
So Gabe asks, why don't we serve linguine and clams here? We don't have insurance for that. This episode did have me craving linguine, though.
Yeah. Maybe this weekend we'll make up some linguine. Not clams, though. Clams. That's gross. Another problem that I had with this whole story is, yes, Dwayne is trying to impress Karen on this date. He's trying to impress her with the car. He's very irritating when he's doing that. He's basically just being Rocky Jr., except it doesn't have quite the charm, and Karen has no time for it. You would think that she would be a little bit more taken with this fancy car and your fancy clothes and everything like that. So it seems like she's a little bit more self-absorbed and not even paying as much attention to him. But then when everything comes to a head on the date and everything starts going wrong and he has to finally come clean, her quote is, Do I like that you're poor? No, but I hate that you lied to me about it. Karen knows. She's self-aware. She knows that she is shallow. But she also expected Dwayne to be honest, completely honest, about not being rich all this time. I think she'd dump him either way. I just feel like it's a very hypocritical angle to take where, no, I don't like that you're poor, which is a gross statement. And then also, I hate that you lied to me about it, which is, well, what did you want him to do? If you want to really like this person for who he is, why does it matter if he's poor? And also, this kid tries to impress her with these things that that's not his reality. That's not who he is. And then she's not even impressed with those things, but the absence of those things is a huge turnoff for her.
Maybe we're not giving her enough credit, though. Maybe when she says, that she doesn't like that he's poor, maybe she means like, this is a guy I like, and I wish he wasn't in these circumstances. I wish he had a better life, not necessarily for her, but for him, because she likes him.
And I would like to think that that is it, but the way she phrased it and the attitude that she had, I don't know. It kind of seemed like she didn't approve. Not that anyone needs anyone to approve of their financial situation in any situation, but it just felt a little bit gross. And I'm not sure if that's what they intended, but that's how it came off.
Yeah, and it's not Dwayne's fault that this is his financial circumstances. He has no control over that. He's 15. And by the way, probably shouldn't be driving that Lincoln Continental.
Absolutely not. And I'm surprised that Rocky let him use it. But the other big problem that I had is also Karen related is this. I was looking forward to your mom cooking us a home meal from your homeland of origin. Like, what is he, Ishbu? Like, we've been watching all that on Paramount Plus lately, and that's just what it reminded me of. In my foreign land. And like this like otherism that she kind of breaks out at this point. We're just kind of like, okay, weird.
Yeah. And at this point, she's only met Rocky. Why would she immediately assume that he's...
Well, she has met Afa and Sika.
That's true.
So, and she knows that they're his uncles. So I guess that maybe threw her for a loop. But I don't know. It also kind of lends credence to the fact that not only does Dwayne not know that much about her, she doesn't know that much about him. And it's this very superficial, artificial, surface level teenage relationship that they're never good.
Well, if you follow the timeline of 1987, it seems like these things are only happening over the span of like 3 days.
But I think the most important takeaway here is the idea that he says, Dad told me to work the gimmick extra hard and it backfired. And we are really seeing that play out within Rocky's life and Atta's life and the entire Johnson family's life as a whole, in that Rocky is still trying to hold on to something that is slipping away from him rapidly, which is his wrestling career. He's still trying to work the gimmick. He's still got the car, which he's still very much in love with and proud of. And it's not working. Atta's doing her best to keep things afloat by cleaning houses, but things are rapidly declining in their financial situation. Things are rapidly deteriorating.
So Atta feels like she's the only one in this family who's even worrying about money. And it's, as we said, becoming more of a problem. Diane's going to the Galapagos for 2 months. She's their most important client. They clean her house 2 times a week. So this means a good portion of their income will be completely gone for that period of time. And she's trying to cancel her Jazzercise membership. Rocky's asking the Wild Samoans about bookings, which there aren't any. And Atta finally just has to get Rocky to work the solution. And he eventually sells that prized car.
This is the type of character growth that I love. And as soon as I saw him with that wad of cash and he's telling Atta, yeah, I sold the car and now we can pay rent and now we can get a van, which will be better for the business. I'm working the solution. I was like, yes. But why did that all happen off screen is what I wanted to know. And I get it. The focus of this show is Young Rock. It's called Young Rock. It's not called Rocky Johnson. But I would have loved to at least see a scene of him contemplating selling the car, of him kind of saying goodbye to the car and maybe having it doesn't even have to be a spoken, it could be more emoted and visualized of him just kind of realizing, yeah, this is the end of this chapter, if not the end of my career as I knew it.
In 1982, yes, it's called Young Rock, but in the 1982 episodes, we get a large amount of Rocky and Atta. It focuses more on them than it does Dwayne. So I don't see why in this episode, where it seems like the most important stuff happening is the financial issues, why we're not getting that same emphasis here. It's a more worthwhile episode if we're talking about these real issues, whereas Dwayne's just being dumb and lying.
I feel like it's maybe just a little bit more relatable, and probably relatable for a lot of working people at this stage of just where we are in the world. For, maybe your career went south and maybe you had to give up on a dream, and maybe you had to kind of pivot to something else that you didn't anticipate, which Rocky very much does. He's helping Atta clean Diane's house, and he's rearranging the creepy dolls and turning them around.
Giving them a show.
Yeah, and then giving them a little bit of a pose down, which was funny. Again, Rocky Johnson brings so much to these shows, and you've mentioned it in a past episode, the Rocky Johnson spinoff. I would love to just focus on Rocky because Joseph Lee Anderson is amazing in the role, and there's just a lot to sink your teeth into there. And I feel like we haven't even scratched the surface. A lot of this is still kind of the surface level stuff when it comes to Rocky Johnson. But I love this idea of Rocky having to step up because Atta's doing everything she can, going to Jazzercise to cancel her jazz plan because it's just too much money and she's having to make all these sacrifices. So I am very glad that we also see Rocky make maybe the ultimate sacrifice in that he's kind of saying, I no longer try to keep up this facade, at least in terms of the material with his car, that I am this big successful wrestler, because it's not where I am anymore.
Now, there is a downside to him selling his car on a whim. Now they don't have a car to go to work in, and they have to borrow the pizza-mobile. They have to get a ride in the pizza-mobile.
Which, again, lends itself to some comedy. But with that big wad of cash he's got there, he's planning on taking care of both the rent and getting a van for the business. So I guess it's not like he jumped without a net. It's a calculated sacrifice for now, and then they'll put a down payment on a van, and, it will ultimately be better for the business. And people will be able to sit down in the back seat without a towel or without having to hover and burn their quads out over the course of a car trip. But another thing that I quickly wanted to mention is we talked about the Jazzercise, but what did Toby from Jazzercise do? And what were the Toby bucks? Again, I feel like this is like another more interesting thing.
This is a scandal.
I wanted to know. And I get it. It's just a one-liner gag. But I thought that was very like, oh shit, what did this guy do? She was very apologetic to Atta about Toby, and Atta had no idea about it.
That seemed like a bigger issue that we should have been dealing with.
What did that man do? And what were the Toby bucks? What were they for? I need to know.
Knowing the world we live in, Toby is probably the current president of the United States in 2032.
Oh it could very well be. But we see Rocky stepping up big time and making a sacrifice and kind of swallowing his pride. So it's only fitting that Dwayne is inspired to do the same by Atta's words that I mentioned, my quote in The Rock Says. And when we get Dwayne making amends with Coach Swick for their heated interaction in the teacher's lounge bathroom, this is where, for me, it started to feel like the 90s Dwayne and 87 Dwayne are melding a little bit. And this is where I felt a little bit of the connective tissue between those two time periods. And not just the fact that he's, being kind of recruited for the football team, the high school football team, but also just Dwayne's interaction with a mentor who is not one of his parents and who is not a homeless man in his backseat.
So here we have Dwayne having to make amends with the coach. We saw him getting really aggressive with him. And after Atta's little speech, he realizes that he also needs to work the solution and apologize for his behavior. And Coach Swick accepts the apology, but like Karen, he kind of has a condition. He wants Dwayne to play football for him. And this is something we had been seeing throughout the episode, that since moving to Pennsylvania, Dwayne has been getting harassed by the football coaches. He's basically being catcalled by them. It's kind of disgusting.
Gross. So gross. They are just preying on this teenage boy and saying all these wildly inappropriate things, which in the context of this show make for great comedy. In the context of if this is what young athletes in high school are putting up with from these coaches, then that is a problem.
This is what women put up with on the streets every day.
Yeah.
So, yes, I feel bad for Dwayne that he's going through this.
But the important takeaway for this episode and the kind of momentum shift that Dwayne undergoes here is the idea that Coach Wick says football can open doors for guys like us. This game can get you into college, take you who knows how far. And this idea that Coach Swick is like, yeah, I can kind of relate to you. I grew up not too far from where you grew up, maybe in a little bit of a similar circumstance. So I can see where football can eventually lead you. And it is out of here and it is to something better. I would have loved for the episode to be all about this and his kind of realization that he has a responsibility as well for not only his family and his parents, but himself and his own life. I would have loved more emphasis on that, but maybe that feels a bit too coming of age drama. And we're in comedy land here, which I think sometimes holds the show back a little bit from how great it could really be in telling stories like this.
Well, they handled depression in the first 1990 episode, and they melded that really well with comedy. So why couldn't they do the same here? I think there's no reason why they couldn't have sort of a coming of age tale.
That's a very good point. That episode, that Check Your Head, episode 4, Check Your Head, I think that's the standard that I've been holding the show to since it aired. And I felt a little bit let down that it hasn't really reached that point again. It didn't even reach that point in the last 90s episode because we went further down the comedy route. Now, granted, that was really good comedy and I loved the last episode. This episode, I feel like, and the 87 episodes in general, they lean a little bit too much into just the kind of screwball high school comedy and not enough into these things that really do have a bit more substance.
Now, I have a little tidbit about this era from The Rock.
Okay.
In his book, he says that when his family lived in Hawaii, he was playing football, but when they moved to Pennsylvania, it was in the middle of the season, so he couldn't get into football. But he did try out for the wrestling team almost immediately. They wanted him for the wrestling team.
Interesting.
He went to a tryout and he hated it because it wasn't sports entertainment.
But again, like, wow, I would have loved to see an episode touch on that.
Yeah.
Because even though it didn't go anywhere, it's more connective tissue to the athlete he eventually becomes and the performer he eventually becomes. And it has more to do with wrestling. And I think the more to do with wrestling on a show like this, the better, because this show is called Pro Wrestling Repackaged. We're here because this is wrestling related. And the further away it gets from wrestling or athletics in general, because I even feel that the football ties in, I think the less I enjoy this show, the further it gets.
Yeah. Now, this is the last full 1987 episode we suspect.
We suspect because, we think there are 2 more episodes, but there might be 3. IMDb has 11 episodes for the season, whereas Wikipedia has 10. Again, I know that these aren't necessarily accurate, and there could be 12 for all we know, but we have at the very least 2 more episodes to go.
But for 1987, this doesn't seem like a finale. This doesn't seem like the end.
I don't know. I felt like it kind of did. It felt like something of consequence really happened. It was a turning point for Rocky. It's a turning point for Dwayne. It's a bit on the lighter side in terms of the story and the comedy, but all in all, I felt that it did have an important conclusion in that it sets up Dwayne's football career going forward. It kind of is that transition to the 90s episodes that we've seen. And it's also the transition of Rocky no longer working the gimmick, at least not to the extent that he had been, and kind of turning the page on his career and saying, okay, I have to do something else. And we know that he winds up driving a truck in the 90s episode. So I felt like this was the connective glue between the 2 eras. So I'd be interested to see how they play off of that in 82.
Right.
Where that leaves us in 82 and where that leaves us in 90. But I don't know. I disagree. I felt that this did kind of feel like upward momentum at the very end.
I just feel like there's a lot more to explore. And with only a 1982 and a 1990 episode, I feel like there's still so much more that could happen here. We only get 3 episodes each, theoretically.
Yeah.
And maybe like how the first episode was, maybe an 11th episode will be a combo of all 3. But I feel like there's just more to say.
There definitely is. I think that they did the best job that they could with the amount of episodes you have per era. I think that they ended this in such a way that I could see, hey, even if this only gets one season, even if this doesn't get renewed, I think they told a complete story. I think it lacked a little bit of the substance when it came to particularly 87. I think that they could have focused a little bit more on more important aspects rather than just the teenage relationship stuff. But at the same time, when you're a teenager, that is the most important thing. And that is the life or death scenario that you're in is, does this person like me or not? That does feel like the most important thing in the world. So I can totally see why that is the main focus. And each era has its own focus. But it is kind of strange to think that we've spent such little time in each time period, and yet we're basically almost done this season.
I think that's why it just doesn't feel finished. It doesn't feel complete to me because we've only had such little time with every era.
And we've yet to hear any news about a season 2 so far. So I'd be interested to see if after the season finale we get some news. No news isn't necessarily bad news, but I don't know. I'm kind of getting the sinking feeling that after the season finale, we're going to get an announcement that Young Rock has not been renewed. Everything would point to a renewal based on the success that they've been touting and how it's one of NBC's most successful shows right now and its most successful comedy. But are the ratings there? Is the audience there enough for it to be renewed? At the beginning of the season, I would have thought it would be a slam dunk to get renewed or a rock bottom.
But it's like we've said, nobody's really talking about it in any substantial way. But maybe once everything's out, every episode's out, they can just go on Hulu or Peacock or whatever, and they'll watch the whole thing, and then people will have something to say. We're getting closer to the end, so maybe we just have to bide our time and give people time to watch everything as a whole.
I would just hate for it to get canceled prematurely before it maybe finds its audience on streaming when you can binge the entire season. And when wrestling fans really get their hands on it, if they find their way to it. But then again, once wrestling fans get their hands on anything, they just complain about it.
Well, you got to imagine they might be now that the WWE Network is on Peacock. So maybe that'll give them more of an incentive to seek out Young Rock.
That is a very good point. There is an entire carousel dedicated to The Rock when you click on the WWE portion of Peacock now, and Young Rock is front and center there. So I could easily see people saying, you know what, when the season's over, I'll watch the whole thing. And they could probably watch it in a few days flat. And then there will be a little bit more discussion. At least we can hope so. And maybe people find our way to us because we would love to have those discussions with the people who are watching the show and who are fans of the show. So I think that does it for this episode. Do you have any other final thoughts on this episode? I feel like it was a little bit of a mishmash in terms of our discussion because I feel like the episode itself just was kind of a little bit. I don't want to seem negative or down on it.
It's not bad. It's not a bad episode. It's a good episode. It's just, I think, weaker compared to the other ones.
It was also very light on notable needle drops. I think the only thing that really stood out to me was the Al Jarreau song, Breaking Away, as Rocky was driving away after dropping off Dwayne and Gabe at school, and he makes his grand exit, which probably my favorite moment of the episode. But yeah, a little bit lighter on story and comedy, but some very consequential things coming out of it. And I would love to see maybe in episode 11 where we get kind of a reverse of the pilot, where we're not setting up 3 time periods at the same time, but we are wrapping up 3 time periods at the same time. But I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see after the next episode if they start promoting the season finale as episode 10, or if we do get an episode 11. But that'll do it for this episode of Pro Wrestling Repackaged. Thank you so much for listening. Join us next time as we discuss Season 1, Episode 9 of Young Rock.
Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at PWRepackaged and email us at pwrepackaged@gmail.com.
Subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. And visit pwrepackaged.crd.co for links to everything.
If you'd like to support the show, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or any other platform that features reviews.
Pro Wrestling Repackaged is a Multitrack Minds production. Visit multitrackminds.com for projects and audio production services by yours truly.